Hello, my name is Annette DeLu, and you are listening to The Heart of You. Hi, and welcome back to The Heart of You. My name is Annette DeLu, and today we are talking to Michelle Fondin about the ancient practice of Ayurveda. Michelle Fondin is an award-winning author of books such as Heal Yourself, A Return to Wholeness, Chakra Healing for Vibrant Energy, and The Wheel of Healing with Ayurveda, an easy guide to a healthy lifestyle. And we can't forget Enlightened Medicine, Your Power to Get Well Now. The other thing to note about Michelle Fondin is that she happens to be my sister. I would like to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm so excited that we're doing this episode because I've been wanting to interview you for a while, and we're probably going to have you on the show a couple more times, actually, because you're so multifaceted and you have so many different talents. So
thank you.
This particular one, we are talking about Ayurveda, which is your first passion, your first love outside
Absolutely.
of yoga. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you first, if you could just tell our audience a little bit about your spiritual awakening story, because I know it really dives into how you got into Ayurveda and that sort of thing. And everybody's spiritual awakening story is different. And yours in particular is a really inspiring one.
Thank you. Well, I think my spiritual awakening actually dates back to the time I was in high school, because I was first introduced to yoga, meditation, and Zen Buddhism, first and foremost by one of my teachers and mentors, who is actually a religion teacher at my Catholic high school. Her name is Leanne Lewis Prescott. And so she taught about mindfulness, which was out of the ordinary for a religion teacher at a Catholic high school.
It really was.
Later, Leanne became my first yoga teacher as well. And then I was dating someone at the time who introduced me to concepts like Zen Buddhism and mindfulness and vegetarianism, which in the late 80s was really far out there. And when I began reading all of these books about mindfulness, being present, Zen, the power of Zen, if you will, it was something that I had never encountered before in my short life. And then it went dark. It went dormant for about 10 years until age 28, when I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like a reawakening for me, because the destructive news of, oh, I might die at 28, when in reality, I wasn't really that far along, but your mind goes there.
Of course. I mean, anytime you get a diagnosis like that, of course, your mind is going to go there.
Yeah. And so my mind went there, and all of a sudden, like a flooded memory, all of those teachings started to come back to me about mindfulness, Zen Buddhism, Eastern philosophy. And I ran to the library and I began to do a ton of research on healthy lifestyle, healthy eating, mindfulness. And then my best friend at the time handed me Deepak Chopra's book called Perfect Health, which was an introduction to Ayurveda. And through all the reading material that I did, that book and Ayurveda, the system from India, it's a medical system that's 5,000 years old. It spoke to me, because what I wanted to know was why? Why do I have cancer at age 28? This doesn't make sense. And really, I believe those two periods of time in my life were just that boost into my own spiritual awakening.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So when you actually started doing the research, did you start to make those lifestyle changes then, like right away, or what caused you to start making those changes?
Yeah. So when I first encountered the principles of Ayurveda, I was also reading Dr. Andrew Weil's book, 8 Weeks to Optimum Health. I started to implement everything all at once, in fact. And before my first surgery for the thyroid cancer, I actually began a vegan diet.
Mm.
And I'm not vegan today. I partially vegan, but I find it pretty restrictive for me in my lifestyle. But I
Yeah.
did a vegan diet. I started again reading more about Ayurveda, the doshas, and Ayurvedic lifestyle. And I immediately started applying the principles. Although it was kind of like swimming in water and you don't know how to swim, but you're kind of just making it work.
Hmm.
That's really what it felt like to me, is like, I'm treading water. I really don't know how to swim. I'm going to keep moving forward with this the way I can. But what my mindset, and I should have in retrospect, but I wouldn't be where I am today, and I wouldn't have written the book The Wheel of Healing with Ayurveda. I really wanted to heal my body. I
Yeah.
wanted to heal myself. And so when I began implementing all of these new to me philosophies about health, wellness, presence, I said, I can do this. I can heal myself. But unfortunately, the point at which I was in at that time is I was married, I had 2 small kids, and everyone around me was telling me I had a responsibility to my family and my kids to go through traditional medical practices at that time. That's
Right.
what I opted to do. And when I say should have, again, I wouldn't be where I am today had I tried to heal myself and went through that. Maybe I would have had a story, but I think the story is bigger having gone through all the traditional aspects of Western medicine, because once I started doing that, I encountered a lot more problems, which made my commitment to learning Ayurveda even greater.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because a lot of this information that you're sharing at this moment, it's all information that I didn't really know. I mean, I know it now because we've talked about it since then, but when you were going through this, you and I were living in two separate places. You were in DC, I was in Chicago. I was in my early 20s. So you were with family, kids. I was out partying and doing all kinds of stuff. So, like, that was a period of time, I think, for us as sisters. We were in two very
Absolutely.
different places. So
Yeah.
there wasn't a lot of camaraderie in that journey because I didn't start my journey until much later than you did. So, and
Yeah.
actually, I remember you giving me some books and things like that, which I still have to this day and I have finally read, but like you were giving me a lot of books by like Wayne Dyer and Deepak Chopra, and I'm like, oh, that's great, thanks, Shell. Like
Yeah.
because you had this experience with Western medicine, and then now you actually have the experience of knowing how to heal your body, knowing how to live the lifestyle that your body wants you to live. One of the books that you wrote is about how you can work with Western medicine in addition to healing yourself.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a possibility that when you went through that Western medicine experience, you needed to have that so you knew how to sort of meld the best of the two together.
Absolutely. And the one thing that I really love about Ayurvedic philosophy, which comes from Vedanta, which is a body of knowledge from India that not only encompasses medicine, but it encompasses other things like astrology, for example.
Sure.
The one thing I really appreciate about Ayurveda is that it does not negate other aspects of healing that work.
Right.
And it doesn't say, oh, don't do Western medicine, don't do Reiki healing, don't do this. It's basically says the idea is to bring the body back into balance, bring the mind back into balance. And however you can do that, do it.
Mhm.
Do it. Ayurveda gives you a template to be able to be very gentle on the body and be able to coax the body very gently back into balance. Whereas Western medicine tends to give the body a jolt back into wellness, which
Yeah.
can leave a lot of side effects. And that's very unfortunate because, you're trying to get well. And oftentimes when you're trying to get well through Western medicine, you get sicker.
Yeah.
And that's because they give the body a jolt. And whereas Ayurveda may take longer for the body to heal, but it's going to gently give the body the idea that it can heal.
Well, and also if you're practicing Ayurveda ahead of time,
Yes.
before you get sick or before there's some sort of imbalance going on, then you're already ahead of the game.
Yeah. And First and foremost, Ayurveda is about preventive medicine.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are 6 stages of disease according to Ayurveda, and it's not until the 5th or 6th stage that symptoms erupt.
Can you go over those stages for us?
Sure. So the first stage of disease is called accumulation. So I think in order for us to really understand this, we need to understand the concept of the 3 doshas. So let's present the 3 doshas and let's go back to the first stage because it's really important that those who listen can understand and conceptualize what we're talking about when we speak about balance in Ayurveda.
Yeah.
So there are 3 main mind-body types in Ayurveda. The names are Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And these 3 main mind-body types are composed of 5 elements that exist: space, air, fire, water, and earth. Now, Chinese medicine, so for some of you that might be familiar with the concept of Chinese medicine, also works with elements. A lot of ancient systems work with what the earth gives us.
We had an interview with a woman named Lorraine who does feng shui, and it is also based on the 5 elements. So
yeah, because that comes from Chinese philosophy. Yeah, so it makes sense. So the mind body type called Vata is comprised of the elements of space and air. So lighter, airier, a little more spacey. Think of the funny term dizzy blonde, right? That would be a Vata type, So if you have any trouble just remembering what it is, think of that. Then there is Pitta, Pitta, and that's comprised of fire and water. So Pittas are intense, sharp, attractive, but they can also be very fiery. So if you go too close to a fire, you might get burned. So they also tend to get a little more angry and critical and even self-critical. And then finally, you have your Kapha type, which is comprised of water and earth. And earth is solid, right? We think of dirt, tree trunks, rocks. That's all earth energy. And then water coming into that, when you mix water with sand, you get mud. So Kapha types are a little more slower and earthy and patient and gentle and kind. So everybody has a dominant dosha or 2 dominant doshas. Very rarely is everyone pretty equal across the center. Now, the goal is to balance your dominant dosha, or doshas plural, and keep it more or less balanced. And of course, everything that life throws at us, we're never at 100% balance, never, ever, ever. But the idea is to get close.
Right.
And so when disease starts to occur on a very, very subtle level before anybody can ever detect it, it's when those doshas, your primary doshas, start to go out of balance. So the aggravation period is when a dosha starts to move into a place where it normally in the body mind does not need to be. So I will give you an example. The Vata dosha likes to live in the colon with air, the air principle. Think of gassiness, right?
Yeah.
That's very Vata. That's air principle.
Yeah.
But let's say now Vata is out of balance. It's exacerbated. There's too much air in the body. And then it moves up into the small intestine. And so now you're having so much stomach discomfort and bloating, and you don't know what's happening with your body. So that is when you have aggravation of a dosha. Is just it moves into a place in the body or mind, because the mind, we have psychological things going on too. For example, let's say Pitta, fire and water. If Pitta keeps you sharp and focused, if your Pitta is going out of balance, you might just find you're getting angry all the time. Right?
Oh,
so
interesting.
That would be a Pitta out of balance. You're like, why am I angry all the time? Well, maybe eat some cooling foods because you need to cool that down.
Right.
So accumulation is when that dosha is getting bigger and bigger and bigger where it doesn't need to be. Because the Ayurvedic principle is you don't need more of what you already have.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
So if you have too much fire, you don't need more fire.
Yeah.
You have too much earth and water. Oh God. Earth water people don't want more earth and water because they tend to just get bloated and they tend to gain a lot of weight. And then they tend to just lie down on their couch and they just want to forget about the world.
And it's funny because we're going to jump ahead just a little bit. We'll get back
Mhm.
to the different disease states, but it's funny because I remember we did the dosha quiz a long, long time ago. I think it was just after you had finished your training at the Chopra Center, and I was like, oh, I want to find out what my dosha is, and so I'm dominantly kapha, and I have some pitta, so I've got that combination of the two, and so the one thing I remember you saying is like, okay, well, to balance the kapha, you have to get up with the sunrise. And I was like, that's never going to happen. It's never, ever going to happen. So this is something that we will talk about later on in this episode is like, if there are recommendations for a particular dosha, if like for your lifestyle, it's just not something that your body likes or that you can do, we'll talk about some of those ways in which you can sort of counterbalance that or find other ways to balance it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, yeah, let's move back into stage 2 and 3 of disease because they're very linked to that first stage where that dosha that is gone awry
Mhm.
is just beginning to accumulate. Then the stage 2 is it's aggravated. So now it's moving into another part of the body where you don't need it to be because
Mm.
it's not comfortable there, right? So, for example, pitta does sit in the stomach because it's fire. So, you think of your digestive fire. Well, people that start to feel like a burning sensation, like they might be starting to have heartburn, in their esophagus,
Mhm.
that's an aggravation because that fire is moving up from the stomach into the esophagus. And then the third stage is dissemination, where now you feel that bile in your mouth. That's dissemination. Now the bile's in your mouth where it's not supposed to be at all.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
So those are the first 3 stages of disease, right? It's now moving up and out. The fourth stage is localization, and it means that the expanding dosha moving out into a place where it shouldn't be is going to sit there.
Mm.
And that's where tumors can happen. For example, someone gets a tumor that's accumulated. Tumors are a little bit of a combination of all 3 doshas, but mostly it's pitta kapha.
Mhm.
Kapha is something solid. So like a cyst would be more, it could be more pitta. But let's say a more solid mass in the body, that's more kapha.
Mm.
So if you get your lymph nodes clogged or you get tumors, that is definitely something happened where it's localizing, going into a place where it doesn't need to be, and it's sitting there and it's
You
not
know,
moving.
and that makes so much sense because when I think about the medical issues I've had in my life, I had a lot of ovarian cysts. I've had a lot of
Mhm.
cysts over the course of my lifetime. And so that would be my pitta being
Mhm.
overactive.
Yeah.
And I remember back when I was in my 20s when all of this was happening, I remember you saying something to me about being just a really angry person. And it was funny because, outwardly you would never guess that I was an angry person because everybody who met me or knew me knew that I was really happy and very outgoing and all these things. But inside, I was truly angry. I was very,
Mhm.
very angry. I was dealing with a lot of pain, a lot of grief, a lot of unprocessed emotion. So that makes a lot of sense as to why I was dealing with that sort of ailment at that time.
Absolutely. And one thing that you need to remember is that you cannot separate mind and body. It's mind,
Yeah.
body, emotions are all very much integrated. And so an unprocessed emotion is going to appear as a physical symptom in one way, shape, or form. It typically happens. We
Yeah.
need to continually process our emotions and our perceptions of things that are happening around us in order to keep that energy flowing, that energy moving so it doesn't get stuck.
Yeah.
And when we have that stage 4 of the localization, for example, it will get stuck in an area. And usually the localization is that it will find a place of weakness in the body to localize to. So, for example, if you always have like upper back pain in the middle of your shoulder blades, for example, that's usually something like the Vata dosha going up there, localizing and sitting in there. Because Vata is movement. Vata is everything about movement. So, for example, if you have a lot of gas pain, as I was mentioning before, and then you let it go and it's not treated and you're always constipated, which Vata types tend to be constipated a lot, but you have all this gas pain and then all of a sudden you just have this upper back pain, which that doesn't make sense. But it's just Vata moving and localizing and sitting in that place of weakness. It finds the weak spot and it situates there.
Okay.
And that goes for any of the doshas. And then that's when the manifestation of symptoms, which is stage 5.
Okay.
The manifestations of symptoms start. I have this pain here. I have this weakness here. I'm feeling like fatigued and tired here. And that's typically by stage 5 is when we go to the doctors. But usually by then, disease has had 4 other stages to manifest.
Right.
And then finally, the 6th stage is disruption, which is basically full-blown illness. That's when you get the cancer diagnosis. That's when you get the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. That's when you get the diagnosis of high blood pressure. The point of Ayurveda is to be so mindful of constant balance between mind, body, and your doshas so that you never get to stage 5 or 6.
So let me ask you this. When it comes to smaller illness, so or you were talking about the big ones, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, but what if you have a cold or a flu or something a bit less dire? Obviously, that is getting to that stage of your body telling you that, hey, something is up. What stage would those sort of minor illnesses be at, would you say?
It's still, I mean, even that, they're still at stage 5 or 6 just because it's still eruption of symptoms than disease, right?
Okay, got it.
The minor diseases are much easier to not only heal, but they're easier to recognize as well, because most of us have some sort of awareness of when a cold or flu are coming in.
Yeah.
We start to feel fatigued. We get that little scratch in the back of our throat in the morning that we tend to ignore. We get that little headache and we're like, oh, why do I have this headache? We start to get that little itty bitty sniffle in our nose.
Yeah.
And the idea is to pay attention to those early symptoms or those early senses of discomfort and have awareness, bring awareness to that. So you recognize. And for example, with a head cold, that's very kapha, right? That's kapha mounting and growing into the space where it doesn't need to be. So for kapha illnesses, you do the opposite, which is vata. And so, for example, that's why crackers, dry toast, and tea tend to work well because vata is a dry dosha. Kapha is a wet dosha. You have too much wet. Now you need to make it dry.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're trying to balance that too much of whatever dosha you're in, you have to do the opposite of that.
The opposite energy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Interesting.
For example, if you have too much pitta, which is fire and water, you would want to increase your vata, or you would want to increase a little bit of kapha as well, because even though kapha is water, it's also earth. And earth is cool because, have you ever dug your toes deep into the sand? I mean, it's cool, right?
Cold, yeah.
You kind of have that balance of the other 2 doshas to work toward, and it does depend on the symptoms. So, for example, what you mentioned that you were feeling a little bit under the weather, Annette, today. So what are a couple of your symptoms?
Well, and it's interesting because even like 3 nights ago, I started getting a little bit more congested. I felt like a little sinus pressure and that happens from time to time. I have allergies. So, okay, that happens. But then I noticed that there was a little tiny itch on the inside of my ear. And like,
Oh,
when you get that little itch on the inside of your ear, I was like, oh gosh, it might be a sinus infection coming on, or it might be a cold, like something might be happening. So I'm like, of course, I'm taking my emergency, taking all my vitamins, taking my
that's
zinc,
awesome.
doing all of those things.
Hmm.
And naturally, now, even though I haven't actually followed all of the Ayurvedic principles, like the getting up at sunrise, but now naturally I know when things like that happen, like I'm immediately gravitating towards the hot drinks, the hot, all of the warmer things because of that. But so it was the little itching in the ear. So then I felt better yesterday after taking all the
Hmm.
vitamins. But then I woke up to this morning with like a full on sore throat. So
Oh yeah, that's
yeah,
not good.
yeah.
So let's take two, because one with the sinuses, yes, that's mucus buildup in the sinuses, which is definitely kapha.
Mm-hmm.
But often with sinus infections, you also have inflammation, which is pitta.
Oh,
Yeah. So it's kind of a combination of both. Which
yeah.
if
Okay.
you have both going on, obviously the antidote would be vata,
Okay.
following like something vata, which would be anything that's going to be drying and cooling, right?
Mm,
So and you the first idea would just be to dry all that stuff out, right?
right.
And then afterward, if you need to take care of it so that the inflammation goes down as well, you
Mm-hmm.
would take things like turmeric. You could just take some turmeric with honey, because turmeric is an anti-inflammatory, right? So that's going to take
Mm-hmm.
away the pitta as well. So
In that example, so if you have too much kapha, which is cooling, but then you have the pitta, which is
heating,
fire,
yeah,
and then you're using the vata to balance it, and that is also cooling.
and dry, yeah.
Where would you fall in the sort of heat range? Because I know when it comes to food and drinks, the temperature of your food and drinks makes a difference as well when you're balancing these things. So where would you go in that direction?
Right, right. I just like to say that with something like, like think of the like chicken noodle soup recipe. I'm trying to think of
Yeah.
like, so it's hot and yes, it's wet, but it's not fatty or greasy, which is going to aggravate the pitta,
Right.
right? The fatty greasy is going to aggravate that pitta. That's going to start to cause more inflammation, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you have some of the vegetables in there, which is also going to draw out that kapha, right?
Yeah.
Because kapha gets very, very aggravated with things like sugar, butter, milk, like all the
Mm-hmm.
things that make us really happy,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
sweets. So, our grandmothers intuitively just felt through some of these things with food, right? So it's not that don't necessarily, when you have a cold or a sore throat or the flu, you don't necessarily feel like cold foods, unless if you might suck on an ice pop or something, that might feel good for a while with a sore throat.
Right.
But it's just, it's making sure you have that balance. So the kapha is not aggravated necessarily, and then the pitta is not necessarily aggravated. But again, it's going to look different with a sinus infection. You don't want to aggravate the pitta too much, because that's going to cause too much of inflammation.
Right.
So I would say once the kapha is gone, then you can focus on, okay, now I need my face to return to a normal shape, so I'm not feeling like my eyes are poofy or something. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
And then
Yeah.
you have that cooling pack for your eyes, right? To counter the pitta.
Right.
So,
Interesting. Very
mhm,
cool. Okay, so we were talking about changing lifestyle in
mhm,
order to really try to come in as much balance as we can,
right.
right? What are your recommendations for people wanting to make these changes? Because I know that you said that you made them in record time because you were in a place where you wanted to do them quickly because you were already at that 6 level of disease, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that was something you wanted to do quickly. But for anybody who's doing this for preventative measures and
Mhm.
wants to make incremental changes, what would you recommend?
I would say do an assessment first and foremost of where your lifestyle is at, where your eating patterns are at, where your exercise program is at. And in my book, The Wheel of Healing with Ayurveda, I have a dosha type test so you can figure out first, like, what's your natural propensity? And
Yeah.
that's called Prakriti. And then I have a companion workbook called the Wheel of Healing with Ayurveda Companion Workbook. And in that book, it's a very, it's a short, it's a 100-page workbook, but I have a test that you can consistently take to test out where you're at today, to have a
Okay.
look at how much out of balance am I? Because I really think that that is even more important before starting lifestyle changes. Because if you have an idea of how far out of whack you are in comparison to where your set point is, then the answers are going to look different.
Mm. So can your doshas change based on where you are in life? I mean, how often do they change? The ones that are sort of dominant.
Yeah, your set point never changes because I like to call that your genetic code, your
Okay.
genetic makeup. It's never really going to change no more than you can change your skeleton, right? We
Mhm.
can't like take our skeleton out of our body and get a new one.
Right.
It's not happening in this lifetime. So our genetic code basically does not change. What can change, however, is I'd say the curves, the wave packets of balance versus imbalance. So let me just give you an example. I was speaking to someone the other day, and he mentioned to me that he's from India, and he was saying, I think he had just turned like 40 and he got diagnosed with like pre-diabetes, but he's like, I'm not super overweight. And I think it's like a genetic predisposition for like a lot of Indians to have type 2 diabetes just based on their diet. They eat a lot of carbs
Mm.
and sugars and stuff. And he said, what's interesting is that the generation of my parents, even with this predisposition to diabetes, they move a lot. Their whole lifestyle is around moving. I sit at a computer 10 hours a day. The
Mm.
fact that I have this precondition to diabetes at age 40 and my parents are in their 70s, they don't have it. So I would say, look at your lifestyle, look at your eating patterns. And if you are in a place where, for example, you have too much kapha because you are sitting behind a computer 10 hours a day and you have a propensity to gain more weight or you have a propensity to have higher blood sugar,
Mhm.
then the changes that you're going to need to make on a daily basis are going to look a lot more drastic. So let me just give you an example. When you are really out of balance as a kapha type, let's say, in this case, the gentleman who was like the pre-diabetic at age 40, for example, yes, would he need to get up early enough to get up at the sunrise and start moving? Probably, because it's so far out of balance that in order for him to bring it back into balance, the lifestyle changes are going to look more drastic. Should he stay away from sweets? Probably, right?
Yeah.
Going more toward the counter of kapha would be eating more bitter, pungent, and astringent tastes.
Mhm.
So hot foods, right? Like that are
Right.
going to speed up your metabolism, eating more fruits and veggies and lentils, right? That's like astringent and bitter tastes. Having a little bit more caffeine to boost your metabolism. So there's a lot of lifestyle things that a kapha type, for example, would have to do when they're really super out of balance. And like exercising for 15 minutes after every meal to kind of get your body going again. And
Yeah.
then for someone who's kind of like, well, I might have a propensity toward, maybe gaining weight a little more easier than my friends. But when I recognize it, I'm able to just modify my diet and exercise regime just a tiny bit. And I kind of feel back to normal for
Yeah.
myself. In that case, I would say you can use Ayurveda as preventive as long as there is awareness.
Awareness of what is going on in your body.
Absolutely. So once you learn your predominant doshas, you start to learn, okay, here are the symptoms that I normally display when I'm starting to go out of balance. So, for example, for a Vata type, it might look like when I'm starting to go out of balance, I might get a little bit of constipation here and there. I might get a little more gassy, or anxiety is another big one for Vata types. So I
Mm.
might start to feel a little more anxious than normal for no reason. And then when you become aware of that, you're like, oh, okay, let me do more meditation. Let me drink my Vata tea. Let me stay away from caffeine. Let me do some Vata diet in order to bring myself back into that homeostasis for me.
Right. A lot of this actually requires you to be in tune with your body, right? And
Absolutely.
so having to be in tune with your body is something that in itself is a difficult thing if you're not used to listening to your body. I
Yes.
remember back when I was having some iron deficiencies. I remember literally standing in the supermarket and needing raisins. Like I had to eat raisins. And I don't eat raisins. Like I don't sit there, because mom used to put raisins in literally everything. So like I kind of avoided raisins like kind of my whole life because of that. We were the weird kids that were, sent to school with cookies that had raisins in them.
Raisins in them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no kids wanted our cookies. So basically I'm standing in the grocery store and I'm like craving raisins. And it was because just naturally my body needed that iron, right?
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
there are those times when it's so bad that like there is no other choice but to listen to your body because your body is literally saying I need this. But if it's not that extreme, and obviously you don't want to wait until it is in that extreme case, you want to do it beforehand.
Right.
What are some of the practices that you use in order to really check in with your body and to really see how your body is feeling and where you might be out of balance?
Yeah. I think the first thing is to learn the symptoms on the positive and negative for your predominant dosha. I think that's really important because if you don't learn like the symptoms on the positive side and on the negative side for your primary dosha, it's going to be really hard for you to recognize when things are starting to go out of balance. That would be the first key. The second key, and actually in the Wheel of Healing with Ayurveda workbook, I have like a whole section on determining for you. So, for example, for knowing that I am predominantly Vata, I had to write down for me in particular, what are the things that start to happen when I get out of balance? If somebody else across the street is a Vata, they might have totally other symptoms that are also Vata symptoms, but they're not the same as mine.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
you have to understand for you what starts to happen. Like when my Vata's out of balance, I will walk into walls consistently.
Really?
I don't know. I was a ghost in my past life because I literally could walk through walls. I will consistently walk into walls, walk into door jams, stub my toe on objects, and
Wow.
I'll know that's because my Vata is so out of balance.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of know what makes you tick within your mind body type and what starts to happen when things are starting not to go well for you. And it's just that awareness, and with practice you'll recognize it. With practice you'll get to see it. But again, it does require you to start paying attention to yourself, and here's why this is hard for most. In our Western model, we are not taught to look at ourselves as our own guru, as our own
Yeah.
teacher. We are always taught to look, the doctor knows best, the nurse knows best,
Yeah.
my parents knew best. We have to reverse that and say, no, I know my body, I know my mind. I should know when I'm starting to feel out of sorts, and I need to learn this and get to know myself and trust that.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I was just having a conversation with a friend of mine here, and she is pregnant. And one of the doctors here in France was saying to her that she needed to do these specific shots because, if she didn't do these shots, then there would be some risk of something. And everything in her body was telling her no. She was like, no, I don't need it. I don't need it. And so, she actually messaged me and was like, hey, can you kind of check in with your guidance to see if this is something that I need to do? And, with my pendulum and my cards and my intuition, like I double checked all of them and they were all like, no, like you can get the shot. It would be fine if you did, but you don't need it. So
Mhm.
either way, it's okay if you do it. But this was a test for her in actually being her own advocate and standing up to the doctor and saying, I know you're insisting on this, but this is something I do not want.
Mhm.
And you have to really be able to know your body and to know what is right for you in order to be able to stand up for yourself with confidence and not be sort of bullied into a particular treatment that you don't necessarily feel is right for you.
Yeah, and that's very hard to do these days. And it's especially hard, for example, when you're pregnant and there's another life that you're having to consider there. And that's really hard. And and it takes a lot of confidence in, again, listening to your intuition, listening to yourself. And over time it does help and it does work. Of course it does, but I think it's kind of a deconditioning process that needs to happen since we are so conditioned
Yeah.
not believe in our own body, to not believe in ourselves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that brings us to the next question, which is how has your practice changed in listening to your body? The deeper you've gotten into your intuition, because I know that you and I have been on an accelerated journey for the last, I would say, 10 years in regards to the spiritual awakening. Obviously, mine started much later than yours, but
Mhm.
because of all of the acceleration of our gifts and everything else, how has your practice changed? Like, have you been able to really tune into your intuition a little bit better? Do you use a pendulum to figure out like what you should eat or anything like that?
Yeah, this has been an interesting it's been an interesting journey because when I started with Ayurveda, I was pretty textbook, and yes, I was listening to my body, but I was very textbook in a way. And
So basically, like, kind of just going through the motions.
no, I was like, if Ayurveda says that this is the best choice, then this is what I need to do.
Oh, I see. Okay. So, like, meaning that you were following it to the letter.
To the letter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And while I do that somewhat now, because it's so ingrained in me, right? It's not even it's second nature at this point for me.
Sure.
I was having some issues, and when you get older, and I knew this would happen. I knew this would happen because my thyroid was taken out when I was 28, and the thyroid affects everything,
Yeah.
and it interacts with your other hormones. And I could foresee into the future. And I said, when I go through menopause, I'm going to have to recalibrate everything because once your progesterone and estrogen levels drop as a woman, it's like it affects the thyroid, right? So it's like
Yeah.
now it's like this. I feel like an editor at a mixing board, with those levers going up and down the mixing board, trying to mix the perfect sound.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm kind of doing with my body.
Yeah.
And now, I was having a whole host of new symptoms that I was like, where did these come from? And it was interesting because now that I channel messages from angelic presence, which again, this has only been in the past 4 years. I was never able to do this before. I think I had the intuition to do it. I just wasn't able to voluntarily do it.
Right.
I was asking them over stages about, and I was even saying, body, what do you need to tell me?
Yeah.
And listening to my body wisdom. And body wisdom was telling me, okay, reduce your caffeine. That's one thing. And I was asking my angels the other day about my diet and saying, well, I'm still not quite feeling all great. And they said, get more red foods. And I was like, okay, that's just weird. And I was like, red foods, red foods. And they're like, red grapes should be fine. And I was like, okay.
Well, I mean, that makes sense, right? Because red is your root chakra. So that's the base
Mhm.
chakra.
That grounds you. Yeah.
That grounds you. Yeah. That makes
And
sense.
it's also like red grapes are also sweet taste, which is a vata balancing taste.
Yeah.
And even tomatoes, if you're thinking of red foods right now, because I know you're thinking of red foods right now. 'Cause I said it.
Strawberries.
But
Yeah.
tomatoes are sweet and sour, and those are still vata balancing. That's a vata balancing fruit. So
Okay.
yeah. So it would make sense, right? But so that's how it's changed a little bit. So it's not only textbook, it's also integrating intuition more as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I imagine that it's incredibly helpful too, because would you have come up with eat red foods
No,
without
absolutely
that,
not.
right?
No.
Yeah. I do use my pendulum quite a bit for things that I eat. So if I need a particular vitamin or if I need a particular food in my diet, I'll literally use my pendulum and say, is this something that I need? It's incredibly helpful in that way because that way you can sort of stay on top of what it is your body actually needs.
Yeah. And then, like a small child, once your body is pure, and we're unfortunately most adults are not pure.
Yeah, of course
Most
not.
adults are, having their cocktail, having a beer, some are coffee addicts like me, but our bodies are not pure. But when you look at a child, a toddler, like their bodies are pure. And the parent of a young child knows it's maddening when all they will eat are bananas for 1 week. And you're like, what are you doing, kid?
Yeah.
But their bodies know. Their
Yeah.
bodies know what they need when they're that young and they haven't been exposed to, things like gummy bears and sugar.
Right, right.
But when we get back to that raw purity of our own body, and just like your raisins, Annette, you begin to heed your body's wisdom as to, hey, you know what? Go in this direction. This is what you need.
Yeah. I seem to remember Xavier, who is Michelle's son, my nephew. I seem to remember him only liking or wanting to eat white food for a while, wasn't it? Like chicken,
Yes.
pasta, rice. Like he
We
would
would look
only
at
eat.
his plate and it was like all like white and brown. I think he's still like that today.
And he's what? He's 18 now. So yeah,
Yeah, he's 18. Yeah.
he can
Hopefully
make his own choices.
he'll grow out of that phase someday, hopefully.
How funny. All right. So, about consultations. So, obviously, this is great information to get people started and to knowing what Ayurveda is and how you can sort of start researching. Obviously, you can pick up one of Michelle's books because they are a wealth of information. But if you're like, okay, I've read all of her books and I still need more information about my situation personally, you can always contact Michelle for a consultation, for a one-on-one consultation. So what would somebody expect to experience during an Ayurvedic consultation?
Sure. So the first thing I do is I will send out a pre-questionnaire that kind of helps me to understand an overview of your current lifestyle, your current issues and problems with your own health and your sleep patterns and things like that, and your health goals, which is super important because you have to have an end goal of how you would like to perceive of your health. How would you like your health to look like? Then when we meet over Zoom, we go over your dosha test, and I will give your dosha test verbally to you because a lot of times when we do a dosha test on our own, we overthink it.
Yeah.
And so I'll give you the dosha test. We will do a Vikruti test, which is the state of imbalance. So Prakriti means true nature. Vikruti is imbalance.
Okay.
So I'll determine where your imbalances are in mind, body. And then after that, we will go over your tests, expressing to you where your state of balance is, where you are now, how do you get back to your state of balance?
Okay.
And then just depending on your health goals, we will either go over diet, exercise, lifestyle, sleep patterns, or troubleshooting. Perhaps if you are dealing with disease, I always recommend like not ignoring what your doctor says. I am not a medical professional, but with many clients in my past, I've worked with them. They'll report to me what their doctor says, and then I will work with them to help optimize what their doctor is saying.
Yeah.
So for example, I did have a client who had chronic constipation. She had some other health problems as well. And we pinpointed a diet plus some herbal Ayurvedic supplements together to help her overcome her constipation. But additionally, she was prescribed this specific allergy medication that was the problem that was making her constipated. It was drying her out. It was sucking all the moisture out of her body.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I looked at what she was taking and I said, well, maybe if you could not take this for a bit, deal with your allergy symptoms. I've had clients with whom I've worked with to get their blood pressure naturally lowered. And so then they got to get off of blood pressure medication.
Yeah.
So, I'll do what I can Ayurvedically speaking to help troubleshoot what you're already dealing with, saying, okay, your doctor says this, let's add this lifestyle thing onto it.
Right.
let's have
Wonderful.
this dietary change on top of it. Let's see what happens.
It's a tool, just like if you were to get Reiki or energy healing in
Mhm.
addition to whatever it is you are doing Western medicine wise or whatever else. It is a way to support you in your healing journey and
Yeah, if any
accelerate your healing.
accelerate your healing. Yeah, and any healing modality you can add on to working in concert with Western medicine, because Western medicine has its beautiful advances. I wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for Western medicine, because
Right.
I take hormone pills.
Yeah.
It's like, gotta take
Yeah.
those pills.
Yeah.
But, it's not the be all and end all because it's too new.
Yeah.
So, Western medicine is relatively new. It's been around for about 250 years, whereas more ancient healing systems have been around for upwards of 3,000 to 5,000 years or more. So,
Right.
they can certainly help by working with each other in order
Yeah.
to enhance, to give you the best of both worlds as you dive into your own health and healing.
100%. Yeah, and it's a shame because so many of those healing modalities from ancient times have probably been lost, right?
Yeah.
We can be super super grateful that Ayurveda has survived and
Well,
is
Ayurveda
still
was
around.
lost for a while. When the British Empire invaded India, they shut down all of the Ayurvedic medical schools for decades.
No kidding.
They shut them down. And then it was finally some small villages that brought back the Ayurvedic medical schools back. And now most medical schools will at least introduce Ayurvedic concepts in India.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, right?
Wow. And it's funny because the feng shui that I was talking about earlier, Lorraine, the woman who I interviewed in the previous episode, she actually said feng shui was almost eradicated for the same way in China. So,
Nuts.
yeah, I mean, I guess all of the beautiful energetic ways, the ancient ways, people have tried to squash them out and it doesn't work
It doesn't
because
work because nature will prevail.
nature always prevails.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we
Absolutely.
are rising into the era of the feminine.
Yeah.
We're rising up into the era of the divine feminine, which is, what is it? Mother Nature, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mother Nature, balance, nurture, going back to our roots, going back to our true nature.
Yeah.
And all these ancient healing systems are all a part of that.
Yeah. Incredible. Well,
Mhm.
thanks so much for talking to us today about Ayurveda and helping educate us a little bit about what an incredible practice this is.
You're very welcome.
I wanted to mention that Michelle also is an incredibly talented tarot reader. And she also does channeling, and she's written a couple of other books on twin flames, and she's also a coach. I mean, she does all the things and is actually in the process of creating her own astrology
Style.
style. And did you want to say what that is yet or not yet?
No, I'm keeping it under wraps for a few more months.
Okay, cool, cool. So we'll actually have a conversation with Michelle about that when she rolls that out, when she reveals what it is she's doing astrologically. And I'm also going to have her back on the show as we go into a deep dive about tarot, because I talked about tarot a little bit in the divination series in the very beginning of the podcast. And it was just something we touched on very briefly. And I really want to sort of go deeper into how to really read tarot and how sometimes it can be really frustrating when you're first starting out and that sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
those are episodes to stay tuned for in season 5 and 6. So, Michelle, do you want to just let our audience know how they can get a hold of you, please?
Yes. So my website is michellefondinauthor.com. And I have a YouTube channel, which is also Michelle Fondin Author. And you can find my books on Amazon or Barnes and Noble.
You can also find her books on Audible as well,
Yeah.
which is actually how I've gotten a couple of her books, because what better way to listen to your sister's books than to just hear it straight from her mouth? Like, it's like I'm talking to you. It's
I
fantastic.
do record all my audiobooks. Yes.
Yeah, she does. So it's Michelle Fondin, MichelleF, as in Frank, Ondin, author, AUTHOR.com. Her YouTube channel is amazing. She's got all kinds of videos on there. She's got tarot readings.
I have a bunch of stuff on Ayurveda as well. I have a whole Ayurveda playlist.
Also, another thing that is really near and dear to her heart is a book she wrote about alcoholism. And so she has a playlist on her channel also that talks about addiction. And that's something that is actually we're going to be talking about later on in probably the next season as well. Because addictions are actually a pretty big factor when it comes to spiritual awakening, because that's how we cope with those things that we're not dealing with, right?
Yeah.
So if you're interested, there is a book that she also wrote called Help, My Loved One is an Alcoholic. That is a book for somebody who is dealing with a person in their life who is dealing with alcoholism.
I want to thank you for joining me today. And I look forward to walking this journey with you and pointing the way on your spiritual journey. If you are interested in learning more about me and the sessions that I do, feel free to go to my website at infinitesoullove.com.
On all social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Infinite Soul Love 1111.
Hey, and if you feel called, I would love it if you could rate The Heart of You on whatever streaming service you're using, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Please take a moment, give it a review. It really does help the channel. Thanks so much.